Your ears do not deceive you. You have just entered the Cryptid Creator Corner, brought to you by your friends at Comic Book Yeti. So without further ado, let's get on to the interview.
Hey, comics fam! Does a realm-trotting dystopian fantasy adventure that cleverly explores Norse mythology sound up your alley? It sure does mine. So I was excited to see one of my favorite comic creators, Eisner and Harvey Award-winning Michael Avon Oeming, is launching a new Kickstarter project collecting issues 1 through 5 of his creator-owned series After the Realm in July. I just got a chance to get an early peek, and it's fantastic. With over 300 pages of material, including 22 new pages of story, it follows a young, rebellious ranger named Una Lightfoot trying to find her best friend. As the tale of friendship and destiny unfolds, the 9 realms are torn asunder, with Loki up to his usual troublemaking self, of course. It should come as no surprise at this point that the cast of unusual characters Michael created in the book includes some anthropomorphic animals. But I can't say I've ever seen them riding roughshod across the land in mini tanks a la Mad Max Fury Road before, so I'm so here for it. Quirky, slightly beautifully unhinged, and completely engrossing, the immediate analogs to me were The Legend of Zelda meets The Mighty Thor with Norse underpinnings for perspective. Michael is handling both the writing and the artwork duties, with Taki Soma on colors and Sean Lee lettering the project. Head on over to Kickstarter and make sure you back this, cause it's epic. Y'all, Jimmy, the Chaos Goblin, strikes again. I should have known better than to mention I was working on my DC Universe meets Ravenloft hybrid D&D campaign on social media. My bad. He goes and tags a bunch of comics creators we know, and now I have to get it in gear and whip this campaign into shape so we can start playing. Another friend chimes in, "Are you going to make maps?" It's fair to say it's been a while since I put something together, so I guess? It was then that I discovered Arkenforge. If you don't know who Arkenforge is, they have everything you need to make your TTRPG more fun and immersive, allowing you to build, play, and export animated maps, including in-person fog of war capability that lets your players interact with maps as the adventure unfolds while you, the DM, get the full picture. Now I'm set to easily build high-res animated maps, saving myself precious time and significantly adding nuance to our campaign. That's a win every day in my book. Check them out at arkenforge.com and use the discount code YETI5 to get $5 off. I'll drop a link in the show notes for you, and big thanks to Arkenforge for partnering with our show. I think I'm going to make Jimmy play a Goblin Warlock just to get even.
Hello, and welcome to Comic Book Yeti's Cryptid Creator Corner. I am one of your hosts, Jimmy Gasparo, and I have a fantastic guest on the podcast with me today. They are an Emmy-winning and Annie-nominated executive producer and showrunner. Currently, they are the co-executive producer and co-head writer for Season 2 of Star Trek Prodigy, and they've been involved in some comics as well, which we're going to talk about. But please welcome to the podcast, Aaron Waltke. Aaron, how are you doing tonight?
I'm great, Jimmy. Thanks for having me. Live long and proper. Let me say on the show, or for people who haven't seen Prodigy yet, live logs and oh my god, live long and prosper.
Well, it's you guys are. I'm sure you've been doing, all the press tours for Season 2 now on Netflix, which just dropped on July 1st. As we were recording this, it's only about a week into it. I haven't even made my way through all of Season 2 yet. I binge watch plenty of shows, but I feel that when I binge watch a show, I'm not able to remember it as well. So I still do try, even for shows that I can binge, to kind of like stretch it out. So I'm like 5 episodes into Season 2 of Prodigy and loving it so far.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think for me personally, when it comes to watching a show, I also savor it a little bit. I find I'll do 1 or 2 a night, and that's enough for me to like sort of percolate on. So
right.
I totally get it. But there were some fans when this show dropped. It's the first time that a Star Trek season has dropped, I think, this many episodes at once. Okay. So it's been a really interesting experience seeing the kind of like waves of fans as they catch up to certain big twists and moments in the season on social media. They're like, "Oh my God, have you seen episode 10? Wow, they made me love Chakotay." It's been great.
Yeah, I imagine it has been. As fans kind of discover when everything drops at once. But for any listeners who aren't familiar, Star Trek Prodigy is an animated show. The first season, I think, was out on Paramount Plus, and then came out on Nickelodeon, and that's, I think, when I first saw it. And now, then season 2, it's been picked up by Netflix, and now I think you can watch both season 1 and season 2 on Netflix. I believe each season's 20 episodes.
That's right. Yeah. So both season 1 and season 2 are 20 episodes, half hour. So if you're reminiscent of, or I should say, if you're nostalgic rather of the 90s Star Trek or TV series with their 20 plus episode seasons, well,
yeah,
you're in for a treat with Star Trek Prodigy.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say about my experience with Star Trek, but just to give a real quick kind of breakdown of the show. Essentially, the main characters are more or less, I mean, children, teenagers who are brought to this in season 1. They're kind of on this facility mining. They don't really know what they're mining. The guy who is overseeing it is not great. And they end up discovering a new ship, the Protostar, and kind of take that ship, become its crew, and then it's like off from there. The first season saw some fantastic, Star Trek characters, including a hologram of Janeway, which on the Protostar is absolutely wonderful. Kate Mulgrew, just fantastic voicing that character.
Oh yeah, Kate was fantastic, and we were so lucky to get her aboard our little ship of a show. Obviously, Kate Mulgrew and Captain Janeway have quite a large presence in the Star Trek community, and in I would argue the TV sci-fi community at large. With Janeway being one of the first, major female captains showcased in a sci-fi series, and certainly the first lead female captain in Star Trek. And so Voyager, when it came out, I think it was out in the late 90s and whatnot, and it was just before Enterprise. But I think in the last 30 years, it has only grown in its fan base, and I think everybody universally loves Janeway. So the fact that we got Kate to come back for our show, we were so grateful and honestly lucky, because she didn't have to say yes, and then we would have had to scramble and find some way to tell the story. But thankfully, understandably, she was like, "I'd like to see the scripts before I commit," because Janeway was such a huge part of my life. And then when she actually saw the scripts that we were writing and saw that we were writing a story truly for all ages, not just for children or adults, but something that you could all watch together, and telling a story that was truly about the ideals of Starfleet, and that sort of hope for a better tomorrow and becoming our better selves. She was absolutely on board and has become a huge champion for the series. So we're definitely grateful for her involvement.
She's fantastic. And what you just said about the show being truly for all ages, I kind of discovered it when, like I said, when it was on Nickelodeon. And my oldest daughter is 11 now. I think she was 10 at the time. And I was like, oh, Star Trek, like, this looks great. I always try and get her to see if she's at least interested in some of the stuff that I would like. And I watched, plenty of things that she was into, and always try and find something that we can enjoy together. And it was the first thing that was like, kind of really that meant something to me in terms of like Star Trek, that we sat down and watched together, and I just loved it. The entire crew, their different races of aliens all working together. It has an underlying storyline, but it has those classic, weekly episodes that Star Trek would have. It's just it's so enjoyable. And so far, a couple, like 5 episodes into the second season, I'm just loving it. I think the third or fourth episode is called Temporal Mechanics 101. And I always think of Chief O'Brien, his line, "I hate temporal mechanics." And I just love the direction of the show. I love how I inventive I feel it is. And the character arcs from this first season carrying over into season 2, I just think has been, it's just fantastic writing.
Well, thank you on behalf of the whole crew. We all of us love Star Trek and what it represents. And we really were pushing ourselves to our limits to try to live up to that kind of expectation of what we knew this show could be. So even, season 1 was made as the pandemic was starting, and that caused all kinds of issues. So the fact that we were able to at least get the season across the finish line was like a miracle, and then people really liked it. And then this season the pandemic was still happening, and we had to write it during COVID. So all of us were sort of, locked in our little cells, talking to each other over Zoom like this, dreaming of a better tomorrow that hopefully will be better than what we saw out the window. The world was falling apart. So it's been such a joy, I guess, for it finally to kind of come out and have people start to see it and really embrace it in a way that I had always hoped it would be embraced, but I think it's no secret that most Star Trek shows, after their first season, it's like the second season is when they kind of hit their second stage booster rocket and truly find their place in the fandom. So I'm so grateful that everyone is really has embraced our show so thoroughly.
Yeah, and now that it's on, with it being on Netflix now, and both season 1 and season 2, hopefully people will continue just to discover it, and it'll just, continue to grow. I mean, I feel like the other animated Star Trek show, like Lower Decks, was kind of like that. And I feel like the fan base for that has just continued to build, which is very exciting for Star Trek in general. I was familiar with the original series and saw a handful of episodes growing up. I think Star Trek The Next Generation came out in 87 when I was 8 or 9, and it was like that was it. Like Star Trek came, and I was just like, oh, this is me. This is my Star Trek. And I was, totally into it. I watched a lot of the other series, but not completely. But I've always, anytime there was some type of Star Trek, project coming out in terms of the movies or the novels or, the comic books. Did you have like a relationship with Star Trek before, becoming a writer and producer on Prodigy?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I've said this elsewhere, but like, and I'm not exaggerating when I say like one of my earliest memories is like a cognizant human being is sitting on the couch with my dad as, I didn't really know what was going on, but I remember seeing the saucer separation from the pilot of TNG. And like the fanfare playing, and then they're trying to escape, and then there was that big energy net that I think the Q or the board created. It was very exciting, and I didn't know why. And then years later, I realized I was feeding off my dad's energy, and I was watching Star Trek: The Next Generation, the pilot live as it premiered in 1987. And so I think that always has been kind of like it warped me that day.
Yeah.
Never really stopped loving science fiction or fantasy because, they allow you as almost like a metaphorical lens to tackle these really big ideas and, social ills, but through a package that can sort of penetrate your shield, so to speak, and force you to sort of reconsider things from a different perspective. And so like that sensibility has always stuck with me. I definitely was a TNG baby. And then, I remember over the summers when my parents were both busy or working, they'd drop me off at my aunt's house, and the local PBS affiliate of all places would play TOS reruns. And so my aunt would put it on thinking it would be educational. And then I get to see like, these crazy like Vulcan Caliphate death matches.
Oh yeah.
Space Lincoln fighting a Mudman. It was great. And then when I went and got into like sort of high school, DS9 came on, and they would air, my local Fox station would air all of the Deep Space Nine episodes in chronological order right when I got home from school. Like they do 2 a day. And so I basically got to binge watch I skipped the first season because I was too into Prodigy, and then I started watching it when I came home, and I basically got to binge watch Deep Space Nine at a time that they didn't really have a word for that.
Yeah.
And so like, I all that criticism I kind of heard later of people's, initially were like, it's not a real show, Star Trek show. Like it's too heavily serialized. They're stuck on a station. Like I missed all of that. And I was like, are you guys kidding? This is some of the best Star Trek I've ever seen in my life.
Oh yeah. And it's interesting to look back and think and see how those things, have aged. And you hear, like, I remember the criticism at the time when DS9 first came out, but all the things that DS9 was able to do, and Avery Brooks as Cisco, I mean, it really was it was doing something very different that I don't think, like fans of TNG or the original series were necessarily ready for. But I mean, it just, again, another show, just phenomenal writing, like really top-notch actors, fantastic character actors that would pop up on that show. And like, what a story they put together.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's kind of a testament in some ways to the longevity of Star Trek, which I think is one of the, if not the longest running, maybe competing with like Doctor Who, sci-fi franchise that all ostensibly takes place in the same universe and continuity. In the world, it's because they were willing to take those really bold swings. Like every time it came out, it wasn't just a rehash of the same thing. It was a stark reinvention and like further pushing afield the boundaries of what Star Trek could encompass. And it happened with TOS going to then the animated series. That was a big swing. I just read an interview with Gene Roddenberry today from 1973 where he was like pushing this idea where in the age of like where they had like 15 Scooby-Doo knockoffs and that was children's animated television. He was like, what if we just did a 4th season of Star Trek using that? And which is crazy. That's a crazy idea, but it worked. And they got 2 seasons and it sustained interest enough that then they could get the movie franchise going. And then, and the movies were bold swings unto themselves. Like they really kind of reinvented all the characters, like Kirk's whole arc of like, kind of like confronting his own aging, and then and infusing a lot of like humor and adventure into it and giving it its own vibe. And then TNG comes along, he's like, hey, you like Kirk and Spock? Forget them.
Right.
Let's jump 100 years into the future and have a ship that looks nothing like the one that you remember.
Yeah.
But that was great. And like I think that willingness to experiment is like baked into the Star Trek DNA. And it absolutely like, the cycle is always like surprise and then reluctant curiosity and then reassessment and then joy. And that is my favorite part of being a part of the Trek community, is like they're open-minded enough that eventually you can kind of get behind their defenses and you can do just about any story you'd like. Like, just look at Strange New Worlds. They just had a musical episode, and people loved it.
Did they? I didn't know that. That's fantastic.
Yeah. All right, let's take a quick break. Hey, comics fam. Indie comic book publisher Band of Bars just got a level up and announced it is now a cooperative. This heralds a new era for them, including a partnership with Dauntless Stories. And they added several new members to the ownership group. Marcus Jimenez is now Chief Operating Officer, Brent Fisher takes on the role of Chief Diversity Officer, and Joey Galvez is introduced as Head of Kickstarter Ops and Social Media Manager, which is sure to increase their capabilities overall as a publisher. And it further promotes their mission statement of advancing representation, inclusion, and diversity in the media. They also established a new board of directors to help chart the new path of their journey. With new projects in the works like Alas Goodbye dropping in June, Unbroken soon launching on Kickstarter, and Pawn coming up with Dauntless, stay tuned to this space for more exciting news from the growing Bards family. Let's get back to the show.
Well, also, I mean, one of the things I think that always sets Star Trek apart is in terms of the characters, because you're getting to play with totally, I mean, really alien species. Like you can come up with all kinds of different things within that universe. But with Star Trek Prodigy, you have really, I mean, you have phenomenal voice actors. I mean, Jason Mantzoukas is doing Jankum Pog. Ella Purnell as Gwen. I mean, really some phenomenal voice actors, but also you've created some wonderful characters. Dal has a little bit, I think, of Kirk in him, but being like a teenager and trying to take on the mantle of a captain. And I just think you've developed some really interesting backstories. Rock, I think, just to get this right out there, Rock is my favorite.
There's a lot of people's favorites.
Just absolutely phenomenal. The science, I assume that, I guess would be science officer of the ship. One of the characters I wanted to ask you about, though, that I was most curious about is Murph. So again, listeners, if you don't know, if you haven't seen it yet, and I know you're all going to go watch it, but Murph is like some type. He starts out as like a little blob, like a slime mold, and has like the wildest arc. No, I'm like 5 episodes into season 2, like I said. No spoilers or anything, but nobody can still like understand him. But he has a definite communication. He's very protective of the crew. He seems somewhat indestructible.
Yes.
But it I don't know. It almost I was curious because it almost seemed like in the beginning he was just something that might have been added, and like, did the writers in the writer room find like it was fun to write for and like his character built? He definitely seemed like he was there in the beginning, and his purpose kind of came along later, and Murph got incorporated more into the crew. Was that planned from the beginning, or did that like happen organically?
Well, it definitely happened organically. I think anytime you're making a television show, when you start out, you have what we call a blue sky period, like wide open skies, anything's possible. Let's just really break this down to what this series could be and explore all possibilities. And some of the feedback we got very early on, especially when this started as a Nickelodeon show, which, Nickelodeon, while ostensibly for kids, they're not afraid to go some very amazing, intense or extravagant places, like as seen in like Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is one of the greatest animated shows ever made, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the first few episodes of Star Trek Prodigy do have it's not all light action-y fare. Like, it's pretty intense. There's some dark moments to it and some dark themes underneath everything.
And so some of the feedback we got, which, I think to their credit, it's understandable. They were like, can we have a little bit of levity in there just so it doesn't feel too grimdark? And we're like, well, we definitely don't want to make a grim, dark show. We don't want that. That's not what Star Trek is about. Like, Star Trek can explore some very, dark places, but they always kind of bring this beacon of hope and possibility with them. But, I think that they were like, is there a way we can inject any sort of humor in there? And they're like, well, what if they just encountered a very weird alien life form that they're not even sure is sentient or not at first? And that became Murph, this sort of like this melanoid slime worm who is like, is it a pet? Is it a crew member? We don't know, but he likes to eat chairs.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think he was the type of character that would quickly become both, kids and adult, like, fan favorite. Like, there's just something about Murph.
He kind of became the mascot of the show. I think there's like everybody, even the skeptical ones, were like, well, Murph's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and we love Murph. Who could hate that little worm?
Right.
And then as the series went on, I think it was Kevin Hageman, especially, one of the creators, who really kind of championed, like, I don't want him to just be, this show has never been about just you one dimensional characters. I would like to have something to do with Murph. Like, let's see Murph grow up along with the rest of the crew and evolve, perhaps in a very literal sense.
Right.
And we had this crazy concept art that somebody had found. I can't remember if one of our artists had drawn it or if somebody just found it online, of this mercenary, but had like a slug head. And we were like, what if he
Okay.
eventually becomes like a quadrupedic slug creature and like essentially humanoid, and this was his larval state, and everybody couldn't get that out of their head. He just kind of evolved with the show,
Yeah.
and as time went on, we knew from pretty early on that we wanted for Rock Talk's character in particular. She is a large, what's called a Brickar or Brickarian in Star Trek lore, originally from Beta canon, which was this large, like sort of rock-like kind of brutish species
Yeah.
that almost like a golem. And we thought, wouldn't it be interesting if everyone just assumed she would be security officer because of her imposing size, but then she had an interest in science, and like,
Yeah.
what better lesson is that, of not judging someone by their cover, but actually letting them discover who they are. But that, interestingly enough, left a vacancy for, well, who is our security officer going to be? And very quickly, once we evolved Murph into this sort of humanoid form that also happened to be nigh indestructible, we were like, well, that's kind of the perfect security officer, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he became our weird little ninja worm guy.
Yeah.
It's
He's
pretty
great.
amazing.
I'm looking forward to more Murph as I make my way through the rest of season 2.
Yeah.
So when I'll get into it a little bit because I just wanted to ask you about, your background, your journey to Star Trek Prodigy. But you've certainly written plenty of things, on your own, whether or not it's a screenplay or episodes of TV, or, like we talk about comics. And for folks that don't know, you recently had a comic in the How to Lose a Guy Gardner in 10 Days. Robots are red, androids are blue. It came out, I think, this past Valentine's Day. It was a Red
right.
Tornado story.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that, but when you're doing something on your own versus like in like the writer's room and kind of like in that blue sky period and pitching ideas, I'm always curious as to like different writers' rooms. How does it get to that pitching stage to you're the person that pens the episode?
Yeah. So, I mean, in TV, each room can be a little different, but typically,
Yeah.
and especially on Star Trek, the way we would always do it is everybody would bring in their ideas, sort of a no wrong answers kind of a situation. Like, just bring us 15 ideas for cool episode ideas or character arcs or things that could, whatever you think either would serve as character or the what's called the promise of the premise. Like, if this is a show about kids on a starship, what is a fun adventure that they might encounter that also encapsulates, exploring the greater Star Trek universe or what have you. And then we kind of put those all up on the board. And then we just kind of, as we talk out character arcs and greater season plot arcs, something miraculous kind of happens where you start to realize that some of those random ideas you came up with might actually start to fit in. Like, oh, let's have a moment where Dal sort of has sort of come to Jesus moment and realizes that he can't just bluster his way into being a captain. He actually has to learn how to put the crew first. And then another idea we had is like, what if we did a Kobayashi Maru simulation? And it's like, oh, that's what better way to test that than the ultimate captain's test from Star Trek lore, and see it break down and kind of rebuild him. And so once those are kind of determined, we kind of pick as a room, like, oh, we definitely want these episodes, and they kind of cover these elements of a character arc or theme or what have you. then we will just have at least in our room, we'll have an open vote of like, okay, what episodes are everyone gravitating towards that you feel like you'd really like to write? And almost every time, I can't remember very often ever of there not being a sort of a natural kind of gravitation where somebody, if you pick like 2 episodes that you like to write, inevitably there'll be an opening for you to do that one. And we always it's much easier, I think, to let people move towards the stuff they're already passionate about because you'll get better results, I found. So,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
so very rarely do we like force somebody to write a script they don't want to have an interest in. And usually by the time we've broken the episode, it's cool enough anyway that I think even it'll be a fun to write anyway.
Yeah. What do you think has been the most challenging aspect of tackling something like Star Trek Prodigy? Has it been just getting the tone right, or has it been, coming up with an idea and you're like, somebody at CBS or Paramount, like they did this already, what
Right.
do you think
I'd
it's
say
been?
the most challenging thing is telling worthy Star Trek episodes in half the time. Like, because
Yeah,
classic
sure.
Star Trek, you have 44 minutes to just kind of hang out in the ready room and, debate philosophically and then go have lunch and 10 forward. But
Yeah.
in our show, we're lucky if we get one ready room scene. A lot of it has to be like catching up on the fly or finding creative ways in the editing and montage or whatever to try to get you to the important moments to where we can slow down and enjoy the trekkiness of it all. But that is the biggest challenge in my opinion of like telling a complete Star Trek story in not even 21.5 minutes because there's 30 seconds of credits.
Right.
Wow. There certainly were some things here or there that we were like, we'd love to do this and that it couldn't happen for this, that, or the other reason. Like, I think at one point we were trying really hard to get a Picard cameo just because we were starting to overlap in that particular period of time where Star Trek Picard season 1 was. We're like, well, gosh, it'd be great to have a cameo with him. But, Patrick Stewart just wasn't available. He's well into his 80s, and I think he had just finished a TV show, so he was
Right.
on vacation, so it didn't happen. But, it was never anything fundamental that we couldn't, pivot. And we still found a way to acknowledge him in the second season, even though we couldn't get his voice. And there's been other things too, like I think there was an episode that we pitched that was like, oh, what if like the Kelvin verse, the J.J. Abrams movies breaks in somehow to our show for an episode. And we were like, we can reach out to Chris Pine. But I think for a number of logistical reasons, not the least of which they were still figuring out the Star Trek movie, they were like, maybe just hold off on that idea for now. But that wound up becoming a really great episode called Cracked Mirror, which I won't spoil it for you because you haven't seen it yet, but that's
okay.
Later this season.
Oh, good. Well, I can't wait. So I wanted to talk a little bit, about kind of your journey here and doing my research. I did want to bring up first before we get into too much detail. Other than you're from Greenwood, Indiana, that's where you grew up.
Yeah, I grew up in Greenwood, Indiana. I also spent a lot of time in the Gulf of Mexico on an island called Sanibel Captiva. Much of my formative years, I grew up just south of Indianapolis.
Okay. And I saw on your, I had to laugh on your IMDb page, which I wanted to bring up. It says, as of December 9th of 2006, you have the Guinness World's Record for most T-shirts wore at once.
Yes. Yeah. So in college, I was a member of a sketch comedy troupe, which is where I kind of cut my teeth in a lot of sort of comedy writing. We would put on a brand new 2-hour show every other week, which is kind of insane, but we didn't know any better.
Right.
And it wound up being good training for like a TV writer's room to be able to produce good content quickly, and be judged by your peers immediately.
Yeah.
So I really liked being part of that troupe. It was called Boy in the Bubble. It was, I think, the oldest, and I think still is the oldest sketch comedy troupe at Indiana University. And I think on my graduation, as part of a publicity stunt to get people to come to our final year-end best of show, we put up flyers everywhere that I would break a Guinness World Record at the the show just to kick it off. And sure enough, it worked. And there was like 400 people there to watch me put on like 160 t-shirts.
That's a great audience for college sketch comedy.
Yeah, it was kind of surprising, to be honest. But I guess if you promote something weird on a college campus, people will show up.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, we took pictures. I contacted Guinness in advance and they gave me a whole set of rules and everything, specifically for that world record. And sure enough, I broke it by, I think, 5. And then I lost feeling in my hands because there was so much constriction from the t-shirts. So they wound up cutting them out of me backstage while I was like almost passing out from all the shirts I was wearing.
Oh, that's tremendous. So doing sketch comedy in college, writing for that group and performing, was that, something you did that you had an interest in, or did you have, dreams of like SNL or something along those lines, or like late night comedy TV writing at the time?
I mean, I definitely had interest in it. Like I've ever since I was like a really young kid, I had like a little VHS camera that my parents had bought to like film birthday parties or whatever. And me and my neighborhood friends realized that we could make movies with it and no one would stop us. So
Yeah.
we started making these really insane, like, I guess you would call them sort of parody films, sort of like Airplane, like Zucker Brothers style, where it was just like a lot of like deep cut movie references. Like at one point, I think we had a short that we did that was like a parody of this. I was in middle school, but it was like a parody of Star Wars and Marathon Man at the same time somehow.
Okay.
Like it's crazy stuff. So I knew I wanted to tell stories in a visual medium.
Yeah.
I did op play in high school, but I didn't quite have like the confidence to be like an actor per se, until in college, when one of my best friends who had got into the troupe encouraged me to apply, and I also got in. And so, I found, like, for some reason, I was like, I pushed myself out of my comfort zone. And I'm so glad that I did, because I was such an academic student and, in the honors college or whatever, just trying to get my coursework done.
Yeah.
That I kind of forgot to have like a social life a lot of the time. And so it was suddenly I had this instant group of friends, that were all extremely talented, some of them far more funny than I am. And we all just got to make stuff that people actually showed up and watched, and it really kind of I got the theater bug there. And I started writing and directing plays and short films, and then I built up enough that I was able to put together a reel. And then I moved to Los Angeles, and one of my friends who I was in the sketch comedy troupe with had, through some machination or another, managed to get what could essentially be considered like a minimum wage job writing comedy for a company called National Lampoon.
Oh yeah, you might have heard of them.
yeah, they did like Animal House and the vacation movies and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
So they were just starting to get into this newfangled thing called YouTube, and so they needed young, hungry comedy writers and performers and producers to like make content for their YouTube channel. And so I came out, shadowed them for a couple of weeks, and it seemed pretty obvious to me that they had a lot of really talented writers and performers and stuff, but they didn't have anybody who could like cut it all together and put it into like short film form for the YouTube. And so I just went to them and said, look, you clearly need somebody to like do something with these stacks of mini DV tapes, which is what they filmed on back then. How about how about you hire me? You don't have to pay me a lot, just pay me something so I can live out here. And to their credit, they did, and that was my first job, was as a writer producer out here at National Lampoon.
Oh wow. And so did you find that did you prefer one over the other? I mean, were you like, well, I'm good at putting things together, I'm good at producing or editing or cutting together, and I can do this while I write on the side? Or did you enjoy both of them?
I liked both for different reasons. I did find at a certain point that I got more joy out of writing because the actual grunt work of making a movie is so exhausting. and and there's no guarantee that it will be good if you make it on your own. that that I I was like, oh, I can just write this stuff and then hire other people to make it. That's great. I
Yeah.
like that. And so I had my day job where I got, my interests of, creating content, YouTube videos, comedy shorts, that sort of thing. And then eventually I kind of National Lampoon went under briefly, and so I had to find a new job. And then I wound up segueing into working in what's called docuseries or reality TV, and I worked on the development side, putting together packages, and I also worked on a lot of award shows and that sort of thing. But during that period, nights and weekends, I basically treated writing as my second job. And a friend of mine who I'd made some short films with in college eventually became a lit manager out here. And he said, like, look, I don't do this with everybody, but I worked with you. You have a unique sensibility. How about I do what's called hip pocket you, and just kind of anytime if something comes across my desk that I think meets your sensibilities of like sort of left of center, weird, high concept science fiction or fantasy stuff, I'll send it your way, and then you can meet on it. And if you get a gig, then we'll work together. And then eventually, there was a project that came across my desk. It's what was called an open writing assignment with a company called Waterman Entertainment that they did a number of things, among them like the Stuart Little movies with Michael J. Fox, like live action CGI type stuff.
Yeah.
And then they also did the live action Alvin and the Chipmunks movies, which made a bajillion dollars. And so, they kind of got in on that IP reimagining game pretty early, and they had a big binder of all these IPs that they had the rights to. And I went in with my writing partner at the time, and we kind of met with them. And originally they brought us in for something else, but then we saw that they had the rights to an old Disney film called The Brave Little Toaster. And we were like, oh man, I remember that.
Yeah.
And proceeded to just talk about how, it had all these great themes that are relevant today about, taking care of what you have and the evils of planned obsolescence and that sort of thing. And we walked out of that meeting, and our reps called and said, I don't know what you said in there, but they want you to write the Brave Little Toaster movie. So that was kind of our first foray into film and TV and stuff. So we wrote that, and then we also wrote, I think, a Heathcliff movie treatment for them based on the comic strip Heathcliff.
Yeah.
And then as TV with movies, the number of movies that actually get made are far fewer than the ones that get developed or written.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So we were like, I think I at least was like, I would really like to get into TV where at least the stuff that we write actually is going to be made and people can look at it, and it's not just, no, really, we wrote this movie,
Yeah.
And so eventually a script that I had written wound up at DreamWorks Animation, and that's where they had a project there that was being made by Guillermo del Toro that turned out to be Troll Hunters, which was a show that he created for Netflix. That was his first animated show. And that was like Netflix had ordered 52 half-hour episodes sight unseen because it was Guillermo involved, and it was a very small room. It was me, Chad Quant, Ashley Bradley, who created Marvel's What If, the Hageman brothers, who at that time had created Ninjago and had written the Lego Movie and Hotel Transylvania, Mark Guggenheim, who created the Arrowverse and who you know from comics.
Yeah, I've interviewed Mark because he's also a lawyer like me. So I went through a series of interviewing lawyers who like comics. So
he always talks
great.
about how he's a recovering corporate attorney.
Yeah.
Mark is wonderful. He's a very, very genuine guy. And then Guillermo himself, and a lot of other great creatives like Rodrigo Blas, who is the supervising director and co-showrunner who came from Pixar. So I got to work with all these really amazing, top of their game talents. On my first TV writing gig, and it was just like this masterclass clinic. Not only did they get to show me everything they know, but I got to show off a little bit of my unique talents in that room as well. And it really felt like a great sort of like best idea wins kind of collaboration. And, I couldn't have lucked out more. And Guillermo himself was very hands-on with that series. If he wasn't shooting a movie, he would be in there every like 3 weeks, and we'd have what we call Guillermo days, where he would come in for like 8 to 10 hours, and we just cancel everything that was on the calendar, just spend time with him, reviewing animatics, reviewing artwork, doing table reads of scripts, and he would give feedback and notes. We'd pitch out the seasons with him, and he'd give,
wow.
And it was very like creatively intimate in a way that I am profoundly grateful for. And it was a really wonderful experience, and that kickstarted my TV career that I've been on for the past 10 years, 12 years, and it just hasn't stopped since then.
Wow. Yeah, I know. I was looking up. I mean, I think your work on Troll Hunters, it was Emmy winning, as well as I think Annie nominated.
Yes, I think in total, Troll Hunters got nominated for something crazy, like 15 Emmys or something like that, maybe more than that.
Wow.
And I was nominated 3 times on that show. On Troll Hunters, I was nominated twice, and then on Wizards Tales of Arcadia, which was the 3rd chapter I was brought back to showrun for, I was nominated again. So I got three Emmy nominations out of that, and I won once, and Annie nomination. And then Star Trek, of course, we were lucky enough to get nominated for Best Animated Series, which is the big kahuna.
Yeah.
So that was my 4th Emmy nomination.
Wow. It's absolutely incredible. It's just so fascinating to hear like all those different steps that, a career can take. As it's why I do like the podcast. Because I'm always fascinated in terms of where you think your career might go, where it actually goes, how folks are able to pivot. But I think I've done 130 episodes now. I think the main takeaway with any type of creative field seems to be persistence more so than anything else.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you have to be persistent, but you also have to be clever in how you find ways to survive. Because I think there are going to be so many instances where whatever path you thought you were on is just going to be completely swept out from under you, and then you just have to find ways to, as you say, to pivot. People often think that like, oh yeah, there's just a big break and some guy pulls up in a limousine and says, "Get in here, kid, we're going to Hollywood." But it's never that way. I always describe it a little bit more of like trying to cross a river by leaping from one stone to the next, right? And it's never a straight line. You see where the opportunities are, and the collaborations, and you kind of always have to do that mental calculus of what's a risk worth taking. Where are you working for free on something that you have more equity in? Where are you making sure that you get paid for your work and credited properly?
Yeah.
You have to always kind of balance all of that in your head as you're trying to whoosh together something resembling a career, and it does get a little easier, I think, as time goes on and you have a few projects where people feel comfortable listening to what you have to say. Like
Mhm.
when I first started, nobody cared what I had to say. Because I didn't have any TV experience. And then it wasn't until I got on a few successful shows and was able to demonstrate that I knew what I was talking about from a story perspective that people started listening. And then, that in turn gave me a little bit more flexibility to tell the stories the way I knew they would be great if they were told. And that paid more dividends. So, you always have
Yeah.
to kind of hold on to whatever vision you have. And I always say, like, if you're hardworking, you're smart, and you show up on time and you're nice, um, and you can get the work done, then that you'll have a career forever, because that's what all anybody wants out of
Mhm.
somebody that they hire, either to create something or to work on something they've created.
Yeah, that's the advice right there. That's
Yeah.
those are the factors. Real quick before I let you go, I've been enjoying so much listening to you talk about Star Trek Prodigy and how you got there. But I did just briefly again want to touch on um how did it come about that you wrote uh the Red Tornado story for How to Lose a Guy Gardner in 10 days, and what was it was and if you could just talk a little bit about how that experience in writing was, and that type of comic collaboration was different from your other the other things that you've written.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I've loved I love Marvel and DC, and I know it's easier to be a Marvel fan sometimes, but I've always been a DC head. Like I
Hmm.
love DC. I grew up with Batman the animated series, and with uh, uh, Bruce Timm, and uh,
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm a big DC comic fan.
and
I
I
gotta.
I even watched the reruns of, like, the Justice League Friends, or whatever, the Super Friends.
Super Friends,
Yeah.
sure.
So, like, it was just so baked into my brain, that whole greater Justice League world, that I've always loved DC, and those are the comics that I read. And then um a friend of a friend of ours, just curiously, it happened to be one of the editors there, the great Katie Kubert, of the Kubert family.
Oh
Um,
sure.
and, she saw my wife's success as a writer and my success as a writer. And she said, "Hey, you know, y- uh, you guys are great storytellers in your own right. We have these anthologies that are specifically to try out, new comic writers. What would you be interested?" And before she even, like, finished, I was like, "Yes." Like, uh, it was a dream come true. And I've always had a soft spot for Red Tornado. I think he has had a number of different ways he has been written over the years, but I always was kind of partial to the sort of stoic, android learning to feel kind of iteration of him.
Yeah.
No, Star Trek aside, it's like that's very Data, of course, but I always had a soft spot for that. But when she had when she said, "Oh, it's a romance anthology," it kind of got my wheels spinning, and just like, how interesting, like, love and loss. And and she said, they're essentially one-offs that aren't necessarily canon, but, like, what if you told what would you come up with? And I pitched 5 ideas, and one of them was the idea of Red Tornado, who had sort of like, he and his wife had kind of drifted apart, because as is canon in the comics, like, it's very hard to be Red Tornado's wife, because he's always getting ripped apart and, like, losing his memories and getting transformed into villains, all kinds
Right.
of stuff. Um, and and she loved it, and so she gave me a list of artists who she thought would be great with it. And Ivan Shavrin, who I think at the time had mostly done, like, covers for Marvel and DC, but he's really interesting artist. um what he wanted to do interiors, and I was like, this is great, because I think, because I wanted to tell a very sort of subdued, like, internal kind of story, we need something that would be very visually poppy to kind of keep it interesting to look at. The biggest change, I think, from writing a screenplay to writing a comic book script is that typically in a screenplay, you're not supposed to direct on the page. Like, it's like almost insulting to the director to be like, "Oh, just tell us the mood and what they say, writer." And in comic books, it's the opposite. You have to be hyper specific. In every panel, you have to say exactly what's happening in it. Like, is it a medium shot? And obviously the artists can have some leeway to adjust that, but it's easier for them if you have that stuff thought out, so they at least can springboard off of that.
Yeah.
But it wound up being a very streamlined process. Maybe it's just because my screenwriting ability, I tend to think very visually anyway. Like, even if I don't always put it into my scripts, that I got hardly any notes from Katie, and I had to give very few notes to Ivan as he was drawing it, and it was just a lovely experience all around. I was so grateful for the opportunity to finally get to write a little bit of Justice League stuff. It started with I think the opening of my short starts in the Watchtower, selfishly because I wanted like Soups and Batman and Booster Gold and Martian to put me there.
It's a great story. I really
you.
enjoyed it. Yeah, I really liked it. I like Red Tornado. I think it was maybe 2 years ago, Mark Russell and Steve Lieber did One Star Squadron that
that's a really good one.
Featured Red Tornado and a bunch of other like C and D list DC characters. But I really enjoyed it. Ivan's artwork is phenomenal. I think it was Josh Reed that lettered it.
Yes, Josh was great too.
Yeah, especially because you're kind of walking through at times Red Tornado's memories, and those little like, how the panels are done to kind of show those like scenes. But yeah, visually, I thought it was very interesting. I really liked the story. It was a bit, introspective, which I liked, and really fit the theme of the anthology. So yeah, well done.
Thank you. Yeah, and just random. It was the weirdest thing. Like when they announced all the people that had written for that anthology, I looked at all the other names, and I knew two of the other people that had written in the anthology randomly, like from completely different worlds. Like George.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah.
George Mann, I knew because we had briefly worked on an adult animated series together based on one of his novels. And then Brendan Hay I had known because he had a show at DreamWorks at the same time I did. So it's just, and I meshed them both. I was like, hey, I think we have DC Comics coming out of the same anthology together. So funny.
Yeah, that is pretty coincidental.
It's bizarre, actually. Like deeply strange. Like I had to think about it for a while. Like, why, of all the people in the universe, why? But it was cool. It was fun.
Awesome. Well, I won't keep you any longer, Aaron. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast and talk to me about Star Trek Prodigy, your journey to get there, and a little bit about comics. I'm such a huge fan of Star Trek Prodigy. I really think, especially now that it's on Netflix, listeners, if you haven't given it a chance yet, you should. If you're wary of something that's, can be just like is said to be all ages and animated, don't be. It's a wonderful show. It has a real sense of adventure to it. The character arcs are phenomenal. It has just the right touches of humor. If nothing else, to get to see Murph's journey is worth the price of admission.
Thank you. Yes, I encourage all of you. Like, if you can't tell from this interview, I am a genuine Star Trek fan through and through, and I and everyone else on the show really try to infuse that passion into the series. It is canon. It does tell the future adventures of many characters from the Voyager crew and beyond. And takes place between Lower Decks and Picard. And if you don't believe me, just go check out the Star Trek Prodigy hashtag and see all the mini Trekkies that are raving about it right now. Like, they can't all be wrong, right?
Yeah.
Go check it out on Netflix.
No.
I don't think you'll be disappointed.
No, I don't think listeners will either. It's a really wonderful show, and like I said, 5 episodes into season 2. Cannot wait to see where it goes. And yeah, Aaron, thank you again so much. I really appreciate it. Before we go, shout out to my brother Bobby, the Cryptid Creator Corner's #1 most dedicated fan. Bobby listens to all my episodes. Bobby, if you haven't watched Star Trek Prodigy, I'm going to make you next time you come over to the house. We're going to sit down and throw on some episodes. So for Comic Book Yeti, I am Jimmy Gasparo. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot, Aaron.
Thanks for having me, and live logs and proper.
This is Byron O'Neill, one of your hosts of the Cryptid Creator Corner, brought to you by Comic Book Yeti. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Please rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff. It lets us know how we're doing, and more importantly, how we can improve. Thanks for listening.